Good afternoon, and welcome to our third speaker series for program directors and coordinators. My name is Sarah Moore, and I am part of ABIM staff. Today we have Dr. Barton and Angie McGough. They're here to talk about board eligibility, equivalent credit, and some other important updates coming. The chat has been disabled, but please, if you have any questions, please add them to the Q&A section at the bottom. And all right, I will pass it off to Dr. Barton and Angie now.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sarah. And thanks to each of you for taking just a bit of time out of your busy days to touch base on some important topics related to resident training. So today we will be speaking about equivalent credit or credit for training that the resident has previously completed, and important policy updates with regard to board eligibility, reminders about important timelines during this academic year, and then Q&A. Next slide. Okay, so the first topic will be credit for previous residency training. So ABIM wants to help facilitate this and make it a smooth process, and remind program directors and coordinators that decisions made about whether or not to give a resident credit for previous residency training or combined training, that decision relates to eligibility for board certification as well. And for that reason, it's incredibly important that you reach out to ABIM prior to accepting that resident into your EM program to make sure that we're all on the same page and what credit you're planning to offer would be approved by ABIM. Next slide. So I'd like to talk about the ABIM policy on equivalent credit for training and other specialties. And I'll give each of you just a few seconds to get your phones out and take a picture of this QR code that will link directly to the key policy. And I'd suggest that you bookmark it for future use. And this policy really goes through in nice detail about what types of credit could be granted and how much credit could be granted for residents that have completed training in other specialties like internal medicine, family medicine, or even combined training programs like EMIM. And the amount of transfer credit that is allowed, again, really related to purposes of board eligibility and making sure that the training in total that the resident completes will meet ABIM's policy for eligibility for certification. That decision lies with the ABIM Board of Directors. And where we have run into problems is that the program director may accept a resident into his or her EM program, have not sought ABIM's approval in advance and offered the resident credit for prior training. And then we get towards the end of the training period, and the training that was completed is not meeting ABIM's eligibility requirements. So we would strongly encourage you that you reach out to ABIM. We can walk through the process in advance and make sure that everybody's on the same page. And to do that, we have a couple of examples I'd like to go through with you. Next slide. So this is an example of the form in general that you'll have to complete to request any type of credit for prior training. And this is an example of a request that was not approved. And it shows some key points that could have been avoided. And I'd like to walk us through that together. So if we look at the form in total, on the left-hand side of your screen, on the left-hand side of that dark line, you'll see it says equal prior rotations. And equal really does mean equal or the same rotations. So in this case, the EM program director wanted to replace an adult emergency medicine rotation with an observation unit rotation that the resident had previously completed. And these are not viewed as equal in the eyes of the ABIM board. Then if we look to the right-hand side of the screen, the same EM program director wanted to replace an emergency medicine rotation with some type of undescribed family medicine training that was completed. And again, they are not equivalent. So there is a distinction that ABIM makes between equal rotations, which really means the same, so EM for EM, and what would be viewed as equivalent rotations, which goes then on the right-hand side of that form. And just to give another example of what typically is not considered equal, we tend not to approve intensive care unit months that are not the same. So for example, medical ICU is not viewed as equal for a surgical ICU. That's another great example. And then the third point, which is outlined here in red, is that we ask you as the residency director to write in the graduation date that you anticipate, or in your mind, you see the resident completing his or her training. And that serves as a nice check with ABEM, and we go through and we count out the weeks of training, and ideally our dates match. But on this form, this request, the program director did not complete that date. So there are 3 areas here that could be improved going forward, and we would give the program director the opportunity to resubmit the request again and make some edits. So again, keeping the rotations equal, so EM to EM, MICU to MICU. And then on the right-hand side of the form, equivalent, really trying to, in a clear lens, iron out what you see as an equivalent rotation and being as specific as possible. And then finally, writing in your graduation date that you're anticipating the resident finishing. Next slide. So here's a request that was approved. If we look towards the left, the equal rotations are indeed equal, and in fact, they're the same. So the EM program director wanted to replace 1 EM month in their curriculum with an EM month that in this case was a family medicine resident, that the family medicine resident had completed a previous emergency medicine rotation, and they were requesting 4 weeks of credit. And then if we look to the right-hand side of the form, this program director really did a nice job in thinking what would be perhaps not the same exact rotation, but equivalent. So they asked to replace one of their elective months in their EM curriculum with a sports medicine month that the resident had previously completed. And similarly, they requested to replace a labor and delivery rotation in their EM residency curriculum with an OB rotation that the resident previously completed. So in total, they requested 12 weeks of equivalent credit. Those 12 weeks were granted, and more importantly, the graduation date that the residency program director saw in his or her mind was April 7th, 2026, and that matched up perfectly with how ABEM calculated the weeks of training. This request was approved, and we know for certain that that graduate would meet ABEM's eligibility requirements. So I think that these 2 examples are perfect examples of where things can perhaps go awry and what is a successful request. And I would encourage you to reach out to training@abem.org if you have any questions. We are happy to talk to you and go back and forth and try and iron out where some credit could be provided. And I'd like to turn it over to Angie now to talk about board eligibility.
Thanks, Melissa. We made a recent update to the ABEM policy on board eligibility, and I just wanted to make sure that you all were aware of it. So I think next slide has the QR code to the policy. Oops, I'm sorry, go back. It doesn't. I thought we had the QR code to the policy. The policy is on our website. But basically what has changed is now what we're looking at is the policy, as the policy states, board eligibility now starts when the program director approves that a physician has completed all of the requirements of the program. So what this means is that no longer a graduation date is not the completion of a residency. So the graduation event, nor the end of an academic year, June 30th, those are not considered the end of the program and when the physician would then become board eligible. For purposes of ABEM board eligibility, eligibility now starts when the program director attests that the resident has completed all of the requirements of the residency program. These requirements may include scholarly activities, procedure logs, quality improvement activities, evaluations, etc. Whatever you, as a residency director, says must be completed for the resident to have finished the program. So where this changes a little bit is when we send forms to you to verify the residency training, your residents aren't board eligible until we have those forms back. So if there's any question when the program directors receive them, if there are questions about the dates that are on the form, please reach out to us. It's really important for the residents to have the sign-offs so they can be considered board eligible. The board eligibility, as you know, is limited. The clock starts when we have that verification that training's complete. We just want to make sure that all of that lines up for your residents. And I know we kind of talked about a couple of policies, and before we go into the timeline, are there any questions that either Melissa and I can answer about the policy and board eligibility or the equivalent credit information that Dr. Barton shared?
I don't see any questions in the Q&A right now.
Okay.
We did have some questions come in previously. Would you like to go over those now?
Sure, we can do that, and then I can just jump to the timeline after.
Okay. One specifically about board eligibility, excuse me, that we did receive. If one of my residents decides to delay their certification, will they be required to complete additional requirements for their board eligibility?
Yes, actually, anytime a graduate delays certification, so if they don't apply in the first year that they're eligible, if they don't take the qualifying exam or the oral exam in the time that they're assigned, or if they happen to fail an exam, that's considered a delay. And for each year that they're delayed, they do have additional requirements that they have to do to maintain their board eligibility. So right now they have, for each year they delay, they have to complete one LLSA test and then a test to completing 25 CME.
Thank you. And then we have another question that kind of relates to the equivalent credit transfer. Does ABEM need to be notified if we have an EM to EM transfer?
So unlike if the resident's a great question, unlike if the resident is coming in from another specialty or a combined training program, the ABEM doesn't need to be notified to approve it in advance, but should be notified that the transfer has occurred. Having had that happen to me as a residency director, I still reached out to ABEM to have their stamp of approval. But by ABEM policy, if it is EM to EM, ABEM doesn't need to approve that in advance, but should be notified when the resident switches the program and the start date at the new program that he or she is going into. It's a great question.
I still don't see any Q&A, but it looks like we have one more. It's a little unrelated, but still in the training realm. I have two residents that want to utilize the family leave policy. Am I required to allow both of them to take the additional 2 weeks of family leave?
So that comes up more often than we would think. I think it's important to remind the residency director that the discretion to allow an additional 2 weeks of family leave so that the resident would then complete 44 weeks of training at that academic level. That decision to allow an additional 2 weeks is at the discretion of the residency director. So ABEM policy doesn't mandate that additional 2 weeks is provided, but leaves it up to the discretion of the PD to decide. So it's conceivable that you could have two residents in the same program or even in the same class, where one resident would get the additional 2 weeks of family leave and not have to extend training, and the other resident would not get the additional 2 weeks of family leave, but would need to extend training if they went below that 46 weeks per year. So it's a great question.
So unless there are other questions that you all would like to put in the Q&A, that is all that we had sent in so far.
Okay, can we go back? I want to just take a few minutes and we'll go over a couple of things that are coming up. As many of you know, the certification application cycle opened yesterday. So information was sent to programs to share with their graduating residents about how to apply for certification this year. So if you haven't received that information, please reach out to ABEM and we'll make sure you get a copy. And if you please share that with your residents so they can go in and complete their applications so we can get those approved and they can register for the qualifying exam. Another important thing that's coming up is I know that a lot of programs are asking when they can get their pass rate data. And that information will go out by the end of the month. We're in process of pulling it all together, and it should go out in the next couple of weeks. And one other thing to mention, I just want to put in here a note of the in-training exam dates for 2024. And the in-training exam will be administered February 27th through March 2nd in 2024.